Though the Bhagavad Gita is usually regarded as a well-known textbook, it is really not intended for the ordinary man. Its teachings, its ethical principles, its ultimate aims are all of such a nature that it is difficult to accommodate them into the normal way of thinking of the human being living in a world of desires, ambitions, prejudices, and traditional routines of various types, all which are cut at their very root by the altogether different outlook of life which the Bhagavad Gita presents. The more we begin to ponder over its message, the more we would find it difficult to make it a guideline for our day-to-day life, though its purpose is nothing but that. The arguments of Arjuna in the first chapter are our arguments. The logic of the human mind, which takes this body as a final reality and everything connected with it as equally real, and the reports of the senses as wholly valid. The senses, the empirical understanding and the logical reason are the apparatus of our knowledge in this world. These are the things that we employ in the assessment of values. And though it appears that apart from the senses, we have the understanding and the reason, truly, the understanding and the reason are like handmaids of the senses, which seem to confirm by their own logic what the senses gather as information through their perceptions, and they do not give us any new knowledge. Our understanding does not give us a knowledge superior in quality to what the senses provide us by their sensations and perceptions. This is why it is said that we are in a phenomenal world. And unfortunately, even our reason, when it is not cautiously exercised with reference to the implications behind its functions, would suddenly join hands with this empirical understanding, and it will amount to an acquiescence in what the senses say. And such were the arguments of Arjuna. And these are the arguments we trot out when our sentiments and emotions are to be justified and are to be fulfilled by hook or crook. Setting aside for the time being the epic context and the story of the Mahabharata, and taking into consideration the principal spiritual message that is hidden behind the teaching of the Gita, we observe that the reluctance of Arjuna to take up arms on grounds of his own is the reluctance of the spiritual seeker to grasp reality in its essentiality. We want a God suited to our senses, sentiments, feelings, traditions, and social prejudices. Our reality and the goal of life is conditioned by these feelings, and we seem to be living for a purpose which is evaluated in the light of this understanding of ours, lit up by the senses. Each one of us has to be a judge for one's own self in these matters of profound significance. Our aspiration for spiritual ideals, God realization, may not be so well founded as they appear to be on the surface. The whole edifice of this so-called love of spiritual ideal may crumble down when the acid test of the superior understanding and the reason is applied, and we would reveal ourselves as poor nothings who have founded our arguments of the spirit on the quicksand of personal desire and ambition. A love for bodily existence and an affirmation of the ego, a confirmation of social relationships connected with the body and the ego, empirical satisfaction in a nutshell. We are mortals living in a transitional world which pretends to satisfy our desires but never does so. But this pretension is taken by us as a reality, and we ground ourselves in the justification of these pretentious promises of the sense world, and somehow or other persuade ourselves to be satisfied with whatever is in the world as presented to the senses, and whatever the emotions regard as what is ultimately required. Though we are not always emotional and sentimental in an obvious form, we are that basically, and our very root as individuals is unjustifiable finally in the light of the larger setup of things which demand an existence of their own, not in any way inferior to our own existence. We have a subtle, secret longing to be independent and fully satisfied, even at the cost of anything and everything in the world. Consciously, this does not come to the surface of our mind. But basically, human beings are selfish. And not merely human beings, perhaps everything in the world. There is an urge to maintain oneself as a bodily complex. And the fear of death is the greatest of fears. The love of life is the greatest of loves. Love of one's own life and the fear of one's own death. One implying the other, one interpreting the other, and each one confirming that we regard this body as our entire property, our belonging. Not merely that, as we ourselves. The social relationships are really physical relationships, accentuated by psychic contacts and adjustable with the temporary features which the world of nature manifests in the process of history. We somehow or other manage to live in this world by a peculiar kind of daily adjustment with the unintelligible processes through which the world passes. We adjust ourselves, not merely with the world of nature every day, but with tremendous difficulty and strain on the mind, have to adjust ourselves with people outside us. And this strain is a great toil indeed. We are so much accustomed to this strenuous life of adjustment with outer atmosphere that we have mistaken this effort itself as a kind of joy and a satisfaction. The condition of perpetual disease is mistaken for a normal state of health. Man is never said to be, but he is always said to become. We never remain in ourselves perpetually, continuously, even for a few minutes. As the Buddha said in a wondrous message of his, that everything is transitory, everything is momentary, everything is like a link connecting itself with another link. There is a procession of events and there is nothing existent. If we are a part and parcel of this transitional universe, there can be nothing existent in us. This is perhaps the reason why the Buddhist philosophy denied such a thing as the self, by which we have to understand the transitional self, the so-called self which we regard ourselves to be in our poor understanding of the nature of things. We regard ourselves as a psychophysical complex, body and mind combined in some manner. And this self, if it is to be regarded as our real self, really it is not. Because it is a part of nature and it moves with the laws of nature, and therefore it has births and deaths. And the process of evolution is nothing but a name that we give to a continuous series of births and deaths of everything. A succession of events is another name for the death of one event and the birth of another event, which indicates the finitude of every event. And every finite object, anything that is finite materially or conceptually, urges itself forward to overcome its finitude by an entry into another finite, under the impression that two finites joined together make an infinite. That is why we love objects, with the notion that two objects coming together will abolish the finitude of the objects. But that does not happen, because two finites do not make the infinite. Even a million finites cannot make the infinite, because the infinite is a transcendent reality which cannot be described by characters that describe the finite. It is not a quantity which can be measured by mathematical laws, but our senses work through space-time mathematics. The argument of logic is mathematical ultimately. And we are sunk in this mire of phenomenality. And in this quagmire of muddled understanding, we try to entertain a spiritual aspiration, a desire to overcome the world, which is conditioned by the world. Very unfortunate. our longing to overcome the finitude of the world, the finitude of life, is directed by the finitude of the world itself. Therefore, we are moving in a vicious circle, in a merry-go-round, round and round, coming to the same point again and again, never getting out of things. Arjuna's arguments were an argument in a vicious circle. I love God for a purpose which is connected with this world. The desire to transcend the world and to overcome the finitude of bodily existence is at the back of even the love for the infinite. So that we appear to be loving the infinite for the sake of justification of the finite. A confirmation of our longings which the senses regard as real, and social values, psychic and bodily values and social values become the conditioning factors of even God realization. We seem to be loving God for the sake of people, for the sake of this world of nature, for the sake of our body, for the sake of our egoistic satisfaction. Arjuna, in a wondrous manner, desisted from the battle of life, which is nothing but the battle with the whole world and with every kind of relationship, personal or otherwise. Now, the most difficult thing to understand in this world is the significance of relation. We are accustomed to these words many a time. I am related to you, you are related to me. You are my brother, I am your brother. This is the kind of relation. But this is a way of talking and taking things for granted without knowing their meaning really. A relation is difficult to understand because it somehow eludes its connection with the two terms which it relates. If I am related to you, it is difficult for me to explain the meaning of this relation. The relation that we speak of remains merely a word with a grammatical meaning but no philosophical justification. It does not mean that I am identical with you when I say that I am related to you. If A is related to B, even in a most intimate manner, it will not follow that A is identical with B. Because the difference between A and B is to be there confirmed if there is to be a relation between A and B. If A is not different from B, there cannot be relation. The two will be one and you would not be speaking of the two as if they are related. But if they are really different, there cannot be relation. If they are not different, there cannot be relation. And so, relation remains as an enigma before us. The whole world is an enigma because of this tremendous mystery that is conditioning our life. This is what the great philosophers sometimes call Maya. You are glibly translating it as unreality or illusion. It is a mystery which cannot be understood, but which controls you to such an extent that you are helpless totally. So the arguments based on these kinds of relationships will fall, because in the same way as there cannot be an ultimate justification for the principle of relationship between things, there cannot be a justification for the validity of any argument based on this relationship. And all logic is nothing but a structure built on relationships between the subject and the predicate in an argument. And the subject and the predicate cannot be connected. And if they are not connected, there cannot be logic. If there is no logic, there is no argument. If there is no argument, there is no justification. If there is no justification, there is nothing possible in this world. So the whole thing is a chaos before us. But as I mentioned to you at the very beginning one day, though we appear to be living in a terribly difficult atmosphere, impossible to understand and more difficult to plumb through, there is something in us inside which somehow or other compels us to get on in this world. Notwithstanding the horrible atmosphere that is around us, which threatens us every moment of time, with consequences dire, does not matter. We somehow or other wish to live in this world. Even if it be hell itself, it does not matter. We wish to live here. The desire to live even in hell is to be explained. The explanation has to come only from something mysterious within you, which does not belong to this phenomenal world, but which you cannot understand with the phenomenal mind, understanding, or even reason. So you are between the devil and the deep sea, pulling you in different directions. Something telling you something inside and something describing another thing altogether in a different manner outside in the world of the senses. The spiritual seeker, girding up his loins for God realization, for leading a spiritual life, he is faced with the complex of the world and the difficulties presented by social relations. What about my father? What about my mother? What about my sister? What about my relation? What about my disciple? What about my guru? What about this? What about that? We have got 100 things to think every day. Now these are nothing but items of relationship. And the absolute is non-relational. We call it non-relative. It is not related to anything. And to aspire for the absolute is to aspire for a non-relational existence. But our existence in a relational world is so tight, and we are tethered to the peg of relativity with such strong ropes that we are likely to commit the error of interpreting our aspiration for the absolute in terms of relations. This is a danger even in the spiritual path. We may like to justify everything, even the aspiration for the supreme absolute God realization, moksha, whatever it is, can be cast into the mold of sense experience and egoistic satisfaction. The love for immortal existence can be interpreted as a love for existing as this individual for an endless period of time. People are frightened by the very idea of abolition of personality in God realization. And there are philosophies which repudiate such a possibility and a necessity. Because if you are abolished, what remains? If the aspirer ceases to be, what is he aspiring for? These frightening situations shake us from our bottoms, and we revert once again to the old cocoon of our bodily existence and social relationship. And the Mahabharata war would not be. Arjuna says, bid goodbye. Here is Bhishma, my grandsire. Here is Drona, my guru. Here are my cousin brothers. All come from the same ancestor. The same blood is flowing through the veins of everyone. What can be a greater heinous sin than to aim an arrow at a venerable grandsire like Bhishma, on whose lap as a child I sat and listened to stories when I was a baby? And what greater sin it could be than to contemplate the destruction of social values and cause sorrow and pain to those who are related to me and who depended upon me for sustenance of one kind or the other? Am I to aim an arrow against the world, which is so beautiful and grand and which is full of such values? The human society in which we are living is tremendously meaningful, and today we cannot see a greater meaning in life except human society. All that we are working for, sweating for day and night is only for human society, and you will know that there is nothing else in our minds. We may have organizations, we may be spiritual leaders, we may be anything. All this is for human society and not for cats and mice and snakes and tigers or trees and mountains. We are not living for these purposes. We have nothing to do with them. We are only concerned with our own species. A frog loves only the frog and nothing else. And it forms a Frog United Nations organization, and so on and so forth. We are just that puny creatures with all our boasted understanding. And Arjuna's arguments really strike a very poor note and a sorry note before the mighty Krishna, who was listening to all this. What a pity, a mighty man speaking like this. I thought you are made up of a better stuff, and at this crucial moment you are speaking. Having renounced all kith and kin and homestead and chattel and taken to God realization, you are speaking still in terms of humanity, in terms of your personal immortality, in a body-mind complex, in terms of justification of the values of the world of nature. You want to have the same satisfactions even in God? There is a story, very interesting. I heard it from an old Swami. It is not connected with the Bhagavad Gita. I am just mentioning to you as a kind of humor. Narayana and Lakshmi were in Vaikuntha. And Lakshmi cast her glance over the whole world and saw a pig wallowing in a mire, eating rubbish. She was really sorry. Told Narayana, what is this creation of yours? If you wish, you can give it salvation in a moment. And this is the compassion that you have. Look at this poor pig. Can you not bring it back to Vaikuntha? Why does it wallow in mire? Narayana said, it does not want to come here. If it does not want, what can it do? Oh, who will not want to come to Vaikuntha, the glorious paradise? But I tell you, he does not want to come. Lakshmi said, impossible. No one with sense will dislike to come to the glorious heaven of Vaikuntha. Well, Narayana said, you can send a messenger to the pig, call it to Vaikuntha. Narada was sent as a messenger. Narada went to the pig. Friend, Narayana is calling you in Vaikuntha. The pig said, Narayana? Which Narayana? Where? And what is this Vaikuntha? And why you are troubling me, disturbing me? No, I am not disturbing you. Why are you suffering? What suffering? I am not suffering. I am happy. I have got my family. Everything is okay. No. In this quagmire, in this dirt, you are living. Narayana's Vaikuntha is paradise. Immortality is what you gain there. Nectar is what you drink. Nectar? What is nectar? It asked. It's a glorious elixir which will make you deathless. I cannot understand anything. I will ask my missus, he said. I will ask her whether she is willing to go to Vaikuntha, about which you are saying. I can't understand anything. He went to the missus and asked that somebody has come, and she says he has come from one Narayana in some Vaikuntha, and they want us to go there. They say it's a very happy place. What do you say? But will we get our food there? She asked. The food that we eat every day. Well, he came back and told Narada, Mrs. says, can we get our daily bread that we eat here? Oh, horrible. Narada said, you are asking for this dirty stuff in Vaikuntha? Nothing. Oh, that you cannot get. You get only divine elixir. Then bid goodbye, go, he said. You mind your business. You cannot give us even our food. And you want us to starve in Vaikuntha. To that place you are taking us. We do not want to come. You go, mind your business. He said. Narada came back, I am very sorry. They don't want to come. Narayana said, see, what did I tell you? Lakshmi kept quiet. Well, this is a story about every one of us. It is not merely a story to hear. It has some connection with every one of us, the poor understanding we have of God and the nature of moksha that we are thinking of in your mind in a peculiar manner of your own, in a fantastic way. Don't you think that you would like to exist somehow or other in this very way, even in the Garden of Eden, in the presence of the Almighty? And would you like to be swallowed up by the lion of God? No, that is a terrible thing. No one can gainsay that there is a basic love for bodily existence and our idea of immortality, somehow or other, a long duration of existence in this very state of affairs in which we are living today. Only we would not like to have these pinpricks of daily life. We are trying to get over these. We want to have a free hand in everything, but with the justification of these ego's desires. The attachments which were the basis of the arguments of Arjuna in the first chapter are the opposite of the spiritual gospel that Krishna is to give in the whole of the Bhagavad Gita. Well, Arjuna was prepared for renunciation also, if it comes to that. He said, I renounce the whole thing and become a mendicant. If that is spiritual life and religion, I am ready. Now we are ready for that, really. Suddenly we say we renounce father and mother. Renounce every connection with the world. I have nothing to do with people. I see God. We move from one place to another place in this very world, on the face of this very earth. And satisfy ourselves that the renunciation is complete. The great renunciation which the Bhagavad Gita speaks of is not this renunciation. It is not coming away from California to the Himalayas. It is a different thing altogether, which it would not be easy for people to understand. And if it had been easy to understand, we would not be bungling in our spiritual life in the way we do every day. Well, Arjuna could not grasp it. How can we grasp it? Somehow or other we tumble into the same rut of thinking in spite of all our arguments and abilities and our efforts to get at the significance of true spiritual life. We cannot properly grasp the connection that exists between God and the world, between God and ourselves, and between one person and another person. And the whole of metaphysical philosophy is supposed to deal with these supreme principles of God, world and soul. An understanding of whose internal relationships is supposed to be philosophy proper. Ontology, as they call it these days. But these principles elude our grasp, because even in our endeavor to grasp the internal relationship among these ultimate principles, we commit a basic mistake, an error which somehow or other worms itself into the very situation of understanding, we remain as justifiable ego centers. We remain ourselves, we remain just what we are today. Even a whit of difference or change does not take place in us. Though we are trying to lift ourselves into that status where we can grasp or comprehend the cosmic principles we are discussing in this tremendous philosophy. We are the same Mr. and Mrs., the same boy or girl, same businessman, same industrialist, thinking of God, world and soul. So our philosophy becomes a mere mockery, a jungle of words, a forest of incoherent ideas, ultimately tiring and not satisfying. We go fed up with all philosophy because we have not been discussing philosophy really. We have somehow or other justifying our own way of thinking in the name of philosophy and trying to bring down God Himself to this world of our personal egoistic relationships and compelling Him to answer to our own needs, psychological, empirical, rational, whatever they be. We are these Arjunas. And we cannot face this problem of the spirit finally. And if we are cast into the fire ordeal of the requirements of true spiritual living, we would be utter failures. And we would feel that none of us is fit for that life. We are just go-lucky people with an inward complacence that we are leading a religious life. But religion does not become religion, or spirituality does not become spirituality unless our outlook in respect to the whole of our life gets tuned up to the requirements of the nature of God and the internal relationships that subsist among God, world and soul. There should be a harmony between our way of thinking today and the essential nature of the internal relationship of God, world and soul, as it is essentially. Though it may not be in utter harmony, there should be at least a tendency of our way of thinking towards that requirement of harmony. Even a first step in this direction is a real step. Even one step taken in that direction can be regarded as an achievement indeed. But the universal has to be implanted in the particular. God has to descend into the heart of man, at least as a little iota of reality. At least a spark of that reality should be present in us. Then we can be said to be treading the spiritual path. What you call the spiritual way of living is the way of God, the way of the Absolute, the way of the Tao, as they call it. The way which leads to the Absolute, though we might not have achieved it, contacted it, understood it fully, but we are moving in that direction at least. Even if you move only 1 inch in the direction of Badrinath, it is an achievement in that direction. Though it is true that it is only 1 inch that you have covered, not more. But anyhow, in the right direction it is. But if you move in the direction of Delhi, it cannot be called a movement in the right direction. So any kind of thinking which is a justification of phenomenal life, physical bodily existence and social relationships which are personal and egoistic in their nature, cannot be equated with the requirements of spiritual living. Though it may not be easy to comprehend these requirements of spiritual life, at least there should be a satisfaction in us that we are after it. There should be, therefore, a thoroughgoing search made of our own psychic nature, the world of desires, which has various layers of manifestation, only the uppermost being visible to us and intelligible to us in some partial manner. The lower layers are not known to us. Psychology and psychoanalysis have tried their best to understand the lower or the deeper levels of the human psyche. These are the worlds of desires. And the predominant desire working in the conscious level may make it appear that the underground world does not exist at all. But it does exist and thrusts forth its arguments. And this is one of the reasons, evidently, why psychoanalysts like Freud, etc., thought that the so-called religion of the world is an illusion. He has written a book called The Great Illusion, which means religion. Well, if religion is only a complacent attitude manifest by the underground world of desires in its outer form of social piety and external adjustment of values, religion would remain an illusion, no doubt. But if religion means an entry of even the least percentage of the universal in this particular existence of ours as individuals, that would be true religion, and it has no connection with the world of desires or the psyche. So there is a popular religion of the masses, the so-called pious life that we live in the light of human relationships, and the true religion of God, which is the subject of the Bhagavad Gita. The reason which would explain why I said in the very beginning that this message of the Gita is not meant for the ordinary man. It requires a great alertness of our personality and total being to grasp its whole message, because you will realize this message was supposed to have been delivered by a cosmic form which included within itself everything existent anywhere at any time, and we have to tune up ourselves to that situation if we are to absorb its implications and significance.